age of 40. The kind of subjects she's worked on, you know, especially focusing on the randomized control trial, the goal is essentially to take over biases. And one of the challenging issues that we have in the world is to talk about, you know, the climate. You know, today is a beautiful evening, but we remember the summer, and we remember how things are used to be before and how things are changing. But is it, there is so much information you hear from, you know, different perspectives. So Esther, I'd like to start, you know, for this audience sitting in Kolkata, how do you see if nothing is done, if you just keep going the way we are going, how would the, you know, how would this place look 10 years later? Is there going to be any significant change, or, you know, are there going to be some hot years and some cooler years and things would roughly be the same?
It's a great question, and one that doesn't lend itself to the degree of precision that I'm using in most of my work, because it's basically a combination of climate and then politics and social science, because we don't know what will be done in the evening period, and we don't know how the emission will fully, how they will interact with people's decision. But let me take a stab. Maybe we're looking at a little bit more than 10 years, maybe we're looking at 10, 20 years. Today was the hottest year on record, and the first where we passed the temperature of 1.5, which was the most ambitious Paris Agreement. It was 1.6 according to Copernicus. It's also the year where you had massive heat waves in India and Pakistan that will of course be memorable in this audience. So in a sense, it's already happening. And no matter what we do, in fact, even if we do a lot of things, it's happening anyways. So one of the things that people tend to focus on are the disasters, you know, the sea level rising, which of course is going to affect Calcutta a lot, it being low. And you know, the increased intensity of things like the California fire that are happening as we speak. But I think even more important perhaps for the lives of most people are not those disasters, but the fact that as the temperature rises, let's say the planet rises by about 4.5 degrees by the end of the century, which seems plausible. So maybe 2, 3 every year we get a different hotter and hotter years. What that creates is the type of heat waves that we experienced this summer in India, but not just in India. In one day in July this summer, 40% of the world had heat bulb temperature that were above what is sustainable for the human body over a long period of time, which is a combination of the temperature and the humidity. What that does, number one, is the kind of unsufferable period, which are particularly unsufferable, of course, if you're poor. And then, in addition, it creates these long-term damages that may or may not be visible. For example, kidney damages that might start in the young and affect people's quality of life for whatever life they have, plus the duration of their life. So I think we should start thinking about climate change not as some increased probability of some extraordinarily bad event in some uncertain future. We should think about concrete, distinct, real changes in our quality of life now.
Yeah. So I'll add some anecdotes from my experience. So in the tea industry, there is a tea estate that our company manages in North Bengal, where we had like 10 years ago, there was a rare instance of more than 40 degrees Celsius temperature. It increased, and this year we had 33 days of 40 degrees plus temperature. In fact, I shared that with Esther and said, you know, what does this mean for people who work in the tea fields? What does it mean in terms of the tea growing? It still hasn't happened to Darjeeling to that extent, but it will also obviously change the character of the tea completely if that were to happen. In carpets, it's affected every aspect. So in Mirzapur, where we produce carpets, we have usually a 95 to 100% on-time delivery. In the months of May, June, and July, it fell to 60% because people couldn't work. In Australia, there was a drought, and the sheep had 30% less wool. So every aspect of the value chain. So the issue is what will take to fix it. And another aspect is, does it affect all countries equally? Because there's different kinds of countries and different kinds of economic strata within those countries.
The really wicked aspect about the climate change problem is that although it affects everyone, so it even affects you, who are generally, live a privileged life, but if affected by your business, it even affects me to a certain extent when I try to work in a non-air conditioned house in France in the summer and it's hot. But it doesn't really affect us as nearly as much as it affects your workers, or even the ones who are less fortunate because they cannot afford not to work when it's very hot, or generally poor people. So this is true at the level of countries, because it will very hot. So that's of course parts of India, Bangladesh, North Africa, are places where it's hot even in the best case scenario. Now, as you add, say, 4 degrees to the Earth, it doesn't quite add 4 degrees to every point in the Earth, but it's not far from there. So you could say, well, it's, everyone is 4 degrees warm or whatever. But the thing is, if you're starting from a hot base, then it's adding a lot of those hot above 40, or in fact, above this hot.
So it's worse for hot countries than cold countries.
So it's much worse for hot countries than poor countries, and hot countries is where poor people live. So first order, it's really the poor countries that suffers. In fact, when you using what happened in the past and extrapolating to the future climate change, you can a team has calculated how many more people will die from climate change by 2100 if we do nothing, if we mitigate a little bit, or if we mitigate not at all. And what they find is that an extra 6 million people a year will die. That is about the same amount as the number of people who die from cancer today, or the same amount of the number of people who die from all infectious diseases combined today. But here is the rub. All these extra deaths due to climate change will take place in poor countries. In rich countries also some people die when it's hot, but fewer people die in the winter when it's cold. So basically in poor countries, in rich countries, from the point of view of mortality, that's going to be a plus. But from poor countries, of course, is where all these extra deaths will take place. Even within poor countries, it is affecting poor people more than rich people. So this is really the kind of problem which unfortunately has not been very good at prompting a lot of political action.
So this is challenging, especially given the language that we hear these days. Number one is, who will pay the bill if it's affecting the poor and not the rich, and if it's affecting the rich, poor countries and not the rich countries? And Donald Trump might say it's good for us. Let's go annex Greenland and Canada, two cold countries, and don't worry about climate change. Then what do we do to that? How does that help?
Well, I think we need to take that into account in our in at least when we're thinking the political economy of climate change. Is that someone like Donald Trump might say it out loud, and a lot of people thinking anyways. And they might be even more dangerous than he is, because first of all, because they're very for him, and second of all, because they reactions, think about building gigantic data center to improve the quality by a fraction of a second or a fraction of the quality, without thinking about the carbon footprint that is involved, taking their private jets here and there, and so on. So, uh, um, so that is a real issue. In some sense, maybe pervert sense, a silver lining that I see in Trump being elected and on day one taking the US out of Paris Agreement is that it should make clear to the rest of the world that no political leadership is going to come from the US. At least not for the time being, and political and economy problem becomes simpler because the people who really shouldn't care much about climate change are not in the equation anymore. The Europeans care for whatever reason. Their youth are very motivated. They are not directly affected, in fact, even as much as the US, but it's an issue for them. They wanted to make it happen. And countries like India, like Brazil, like South Africa, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, who have, dynamic economy in their own ways, and who are on the front line of suffering for climate change, are in a position to say, well, we are going, if you're not going to do it, we are going to do it.
But how? Because the countries you mentioned, they hardly do anything together. So how will they get together on climate change?
Well, for example, take India. India is a pretty unique position. For most countries, dealing with climate change is doing a service to the world. And that's not something that the world is very good at doing at this moment. India is pretty unique in that it's a big country. It's quite hot. It has regions that are the most susceptible. Something like 700 million in the north of India and that band are susceptible to this unsustainable increase in global temperature. A lot of the impacts of the pollutants that lead to climate change also lead to pollution and are killing people right now. So for a lot of reasons, India has sort of a lot of self-interested reason to decide to get into the action now.
And what should India do?
So first of all, think about the renewables. Uh, Even a few years ago, it seemed maybe something cute to think about, something that people had in the corner of their, a glint in their eyes, but the truth was cool, I guess. But since then, the cost of renewable has gone down tremendously. The technologies exist. India has nothing if not a lot of sun. It also has dams. It also has rivers where it could. So India is poised potentially to do a lot of on renewable and to power. India has huge electricity needs. So the issue with India is today not contributing very much to climate change at all. On average, the carbon footprint of the average Indian person is very low. But when you think moving forward, basically there are several paths we could decide to take now as a country. I'm putting myself in we by in-law association. So the trajectory could be very different. It's much easier to take a clean trajectory than to undo a bad trajectory. That's what the US is discovering now, which is
leapfrog in the way that
leapfrog in the way that and
energy is used for the first time.
and the thing in India is that that's going to be the benefits of reducing climate change accrues in a disproportionate way to
And
Indian citizens, number one, and the co-benefits in terms of reduced pollution, which is killing many more people today than climate change for the moment and will for years to come, are also very evident. So that's one way that is not saying, oh well, we do have to. I mean, we do have to get electricity to people in the countryside. That can be done. We can be mindful about how we are going to approach this. That's one example.
Also, because we import a lot of our energy, maybe it can also become something which is using sun or other sources could be good for our security. Is this something the Indian government needs to do? Is there a technological or a marketplace solution for climate change in India that Indian private sector and Indian households or individuals can do?
So the issue is we don't know. There is kind of a positive scenario where there is a need for big investments in the short run, which should be government facilitated in a way, in new plants, etc. And then it's going to eventually drive the cost down of renewable, and it's going to pay for itself, and everything will be good. It is, but we don't know whether that's going to be sufficient. It is. There is a scenario where we follow that nice path, and the renewable become cheap enough that they become the dominant source of energy. And there is a scenario where it doesn't happen, where in fact, as renewable become cheaper, the non-renewable, there is less demand on the new renewable, they become cheaper too, and therefore the demand for all kind of energy increases, and therefore we need to act also on people's behavior. So I don't know in which way we live, and therefore we need to prepare for both. And preparing for both meaning what kind of consumption we think is starting to act on our consumption pattern as a whole. So people, again, going back to the difference between poor people and rich people. Poor people in India and in the world are the biggest victim of climate change. Within India, it's also true, of course. Richer people have air conditioning. Richer people don't need to work out in the sun when it's very hot. Poor people don't have air conditioning, and poor people have to work in the sun when it's hot. In fact, during heat wave, it's mostly in a rural area that people die. Even though it's less hot in rural areas because there is a kind of a greenhouse effect inside the cities itself. But the reason is that poor people cannot afford not to go work even when it's hot. And as they're working more in bad conditions, the salaries go down. Not in your line of trade, but in agriculture, the salaries goes down because so many people want to work harder. Yes. And they have to work even harder. And that is what we also need government, also because they contribute nothing to climate change. We need government intervention to make sure that some kind of behavior are not acceptable, or some kind of behavior are very severely, so severely taxed that they don't become acceptable. It's not just an India problem, but it's becoming an India problem. It used to be that most of the inequality between people in the world, as far as the emission that contribute to climate change, was between countries. So India contributes nothing, and the US contributes a lot. And in fact, India still lives in this world from a point of view of climate negotiation as representing the interest of the world's poor, which is great and should continue to do. But now, the inequality in emission is much more within country across rich and poor people than across countries. Two-thirds of the inequality of emission is within rich and poor, as opposed to between rich countries and poor countries. So India, like other countries, like Europe very much, needs to start thinking about curbing very high emission from very rich people. And that means, things like high enough carbon taxes. That means that potentially high enough wealth taxes. That means not condoning behavior like flying private jets here and there. In Europe, there is discussion of making private jets just illegal, for example.
So the negotiation of this, you're like from a behavioral point of view, India comes into negotiations saying we have not reduced some of the emissions, but you're saying that India will suffer in the future. That's why, for its own interest, it has to be. How do you nudge individual and government to change the thinking while negotiating for climate change? One is what should happen, but is there any behavioral tools to make it more likely, like you were talking about taxes and other forms?
So from a moral perspective, I'm totally in line with the India position, which is also the G77 plus China position, which is to say, look, guys, we didn't do this. You have, in a sense, there is a duty of reparation from countries that not only have caused the problem, but have become rich and are still rich due to the problem. So it's not just a reparation for the past emissions that have contributed to climate change, but also for the fact that we in Europe, this time my country of origin, or in the US where I live now, we are still rich on the back of these emissions that are making everybody suffer now. So I think the moral argument is always with them. As a practical political matter, as a pragmatic matter, it's going nowhere in international negotiation because the Europe and the US, and that's not a Trump issue, that's much broader, much bigger, will never accept the principle of liability for past action. Because once they open that can of worm, there is slavery, there is colonization, there is, what we did, what the UK, what the Britain did to India, and what France did to Haiti, and when does it end? So the countries will simply, when you look at, which I have done in the past few weeks in detail at international negotiation, the moment there is a whiff of the notion of negotiation, mindset, which is to say, look, Europe. That's why, in a sense, getting the US out of the equation helps
But
things.
Trump is a good deal maker. Can't he be part of it?
Well, he got out of Paris, so he doesn't care because he understands that it's really not in the self-interest in the US, and fortunately, understands it too well. In at least in the short run, maybe it will change if we get more catastrophe like the LA fire or whatnot, where there will finally be a demand for that. But for the time being, Europe definitely wants to do something about climate change. The emission in Europe and in fact in the US are falling fast enough that by 2050 they might be close to net zero. If they are close to net zero, but India and China and Brazil are still emitting like there is no tomorrow, then they are not going to achieve their goal. So the deal making would be to say, fine, we can do something, but you have to compensate us. And I don't think the framing the argument in terms of how much it will cost or is particularly helpful because a lot of these investments can actually be done. The mitigation investment can be undertaken by the private sector. The issue is really the compensation thing, which is what do you do about poor people who are suffering for climate change? What do you do about poor people who are dying because of climate change? That's a much smaller bill than what it will cost to do mitigation. I estimated the bill to be about 500 billion a year. Is the mortality damages of the US and Europe's emission in terms of how much, if you value the lives lost. If the country like India or Brazil showed up and said, look, you find a way to find this money and to deliver it to our poor people, then in exchange, we start putting things like carbon tax or like stronger regulation on our economies, and moving forward, our path will be much uh, less steep than it was otherwise be. I think that's very feasible. And I don't know if it's politically feasible. I think it's technologically feasible. And I think that's not a bad deal to propose. So this is, that said, I've never concluded a deal or been in business, or maybe or done international politics, so maybe it's like crazy to suggest. But that's the one I would put on the table.
What would you, you've been to Kolkata a few times, what would you say are the priorities for Kolkata for becoming more climate resilient?
Well, a lot of the Kolkata problem needs to be dealt with south of Kolkata. Basically, there is a huge issue with the delta, with the fact that the mangrove and the Sundarbans have not been protected, that there is a kind of too much investments in that is not respecting the environment, and that basically affects Kolkata directly. So the first thing is to think more broadly about the entire region, the entire delta, because that's what protects Kolkata. That I would say is the biggest thing in terms of the water damages. And then the people, thinking again, if I were making decision for Kolkata, I would try to make them having the lives of the poor people in mind. So some of the construction where people live are the ones that are the most fragile in case of another cyclone like Amphan or something worse than that. So protecting and securing this household would be my second priority. And the third one is the handling of water. managing Calcutta is actually not the worst place for that, but a place like Bangalore, for example, um, got rid of many of the ponds that they actually do need for drinking water and for managing any storms, and that something similar is happening in Kolkata with some ponds that are absolutely essential for the stabilization in case of water not being there anymore. So rethinking that entire water system would probably be the third thing. But then, I'm not an expert in urban geography.
So the last time we had a global crisis, and climate change may be a different order of global crisis, was the COVID. The way the countries worked for COVID, distribution of vaccines or payment of vaccines, or how there were travel restrictions. Does it give you hope, or does it worry you that climate change, when the countries have to work together for something like climate change, does it give you is it a good example of countries working together, or is it a bad example?
It's a terrible example. And in fact, during COVID, this is where you see my rather, half full attitude to life in general. At the beginning of COVID, Abhijit and I penned an op-ed to say we need to start now about a Marshall Plan for poor countries because economies will have to shut down. You can recover from it, but you need, which happens in Japan and in Europe after the World War II, but it requires a tremendous investment. We should get ready for that, and with that, poor countries will not suffer more than they need to. Now, what happened to that great idea? So, COVID shutdown happened, and the rich countries spend about 27% of their GDP in fiscal stimulus measure for their citizens. So maintain their salaries or higher unemployment benefits or various kind of help. And that did mean that the moment they reopened, they took off. As we predicted would happen with inflation and whatnot, but they did take off. And people are richer now in the US than they were before COVID. Much richer, in particular for people. And those measures have something to do with it. Now, in poor countries, so how did poor countries do that? They borrowed like crazy, which they could do at very low interest rates. Now, in poor countries, or even a middle-income country like India, that's not an option. India was not able to go on the market and say, hey, give us a huge loan, because we also want to spend 27% of our GDP on fiscal stimulus measure. That was not available. So the poorer countries, of which India is not one of them, but the poorest country spend 2% of their of their GDP in fiscal stimulus measure. So that's countries in Africa. And what does it mean? It means that when the COVID restriction lifted and the world restarted, they didn't go anywhere. They didn't take off because they were not in a position to help people reopen their business or help people keep their business, and people fell into poverty traps that they haven't gotten out since then. That's one. The other one, of course, is the vaccine. We created COVAX in order to buy vaccines for the rest of the world. Uh, India was lucky enough that they had their own, but most Africa, of course, didn't have anything. And then rich country immediately proceeded to hoard all the doses that were available and were absolutely not willing to share them until much later when they didn't want them anymore. So before, in May of 2021, we had written another op-ed saying, just before Glasgow, the COP in Glasgow, saying, well, it would be nice if we made a gesture in favor of vaccines to show our goodwill and our ability to work together if you want poor countries to work with it in Glasgow. Now, nothing was done on vaccines. Glasgow happened, it was a disaster. And it was, I think, the kind of the way that this big animosity that you see now in the climate negotiations since then really started. And so I think COVID it's not just a bad example, but it also had a distinct effect.
Warning, essentially.
And it has a distinct effect in making poor countries really resentful and not really willing to play together. And I get it, I understand, I share that resentment. On the other hand, again, it's like, okay, but we need to do, as poor countries, we need to do it for us because help is that's how help is not coming from elsewhere. Even if it's annoying that one low and middle income country need to do the work that the rich country haven't done. It's there is no I think there is no other path with the help of Europe. Potentially, which I think can be brought in to this, and has already made a lot of progress on their own emission, which is a starting point.
So, does anything give you hope that things would be not worse off? Because much of this seems like it seems a very steep climb to change the behavior from what happened during COVID, to see the poor countries get funds, which the rich countries, in some cases, would have to sponsor maybe. Some of it can come from the poor countries. Is there anything that makes you optimistic? You spoke a little bit about solar and other areas, but, you know, or is it something that is a big concern, in the long-term future of populations around the world?
Well, I think that human ingenuity has been a good driving force. There has been a lot of progress in technologies that can make it possible for us to mitigate the problem, like the cost of renewable. There is elevated consciousness among the younger population, both in Europe and in countries like India, for example, that we see everywhere. Which means that I think a lot of our consumption needs are not really needs in the sense that they are biological needs or strong compulsions. They are engineered by society around us and inspired by when we see other people do other things. So I think changing behavior at the individual level will be essential, or is essential even today. But I also think it's much easier than we think. And for example, when you see in Paris, people used to drive everywhere to work, and then a number of things have happened where somehow people stopped driving, and now they have never took up driving again. People cycle, they take the subway, and I don't think they are unhappy for having that different lifestyle. They are quite happy. So in a way, as social animals, we are very much responsive to what other people do around us and what social norms happens to be. We are very much, and also as economic animal, we depend on infrastructure around us. So I think actually changing behavior in significant way is possible. In fact, it's been done. You see, I gave the example of Paris, but it's not just Paris. Today, the European middle class, everyone up to the 75th percent of the distribution of income, emit considerably less CO2 than the rich people in Asia. So what really we need to work on is continuing that from government point of view, creating the infrastructure that makes it possible for people to do that, and of course giving kind of the right example and sending the right messages. And and as far as the very, very, very rich, very high polluters, because that's correlated, what gives me a little bit of hope is that, in particular, with the G20 presidency in Brazil, there is now a real conversation about taxing their wealth a little bit to make sure that they contribute to uh, undo the damage that is being done. Not a lot. That is not. They can still continue the lifestyle if they want to have it, but at least in creating those funds that would make those deals possible. And the fact that Brazil took up that question, that South Africa, who just took over the G20, is continuing to push it up. It's also, I think, a good example of a little bit of the center of gravity of political power moving south, which in and of itself is positive from this point of view.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, you heard Esther. The solution is not easy. It's not going to be solved by economics alone. It's not going to be solved by politics alone. It requires a combination of moral and human ingenuity, and it is to protect the earth. So it is basically humanity has to come together, not only because it's good for economics or good for politics, but to protect the only home we have. So I know, Esther, you're coming up with a book. When is it due?
When it will be published, I don't know, but maybe within a year or two. Yeah.
So maybe next literary meet we can discuss, after reading the book. But at this point, after having heard us speak, after having heard Esther speak, any thoughts or questions? So if the mic can be sent.
Thank you so much for being here and wearing the beautiful sari that you are. Okay, so it's a little long, excuse me. So we're in the sixth epoch, right? We've gone through 5 mass extinctions, and change is constant, right? So we know that the sixth mass extinction is coming. Um, you did speak about how we can keep hope, which was part of my question. And the scientists date about 2100 to be approximate the date of the next mass extinction, and we're already finished in the first quarter of that. So my question is things like plastic pollution. So why is that? It's such a simple thing of single-use plastic. Why is that not already banned globally? Secondly, why is the awareness amongst the common people, even amongst the richer educated classes, so low? And even they are very ignorant about it. Um, and lastly, I would like to know what really is the answer to this. Why is this change happening? Because the previous mass extinctions we have seen have been driven by external factors. The current situation which we are seeing has been driven by a single species. So that to me is kind of
That is, if we
terrifying.
were to get extinct, we're still here.
We're still here.
So okay, can you give
And
the answer? So
just,
I think you asked the question. So
yes,
can you
okay.
give?
So let me take the kind of the middle one, which is the very interesting and very important question relates to what needs to be done. Is this idea that, for example, in India, Indians suffer from terrible level of pollution. This is uh, home to, now that China got their act together, it's home to some of the most polluted cities on earth. And um, it's been very difficult to do something about it, partly because the political demand is not there. And that is something that has always puzzled me, because you would think people who are literally choking should have a view about that. That would be powerful. And how we, but that relates to, I think, the difficulty when people have very complicated lives already. They have many balls that they are trying to keep together. They are juggling many things, and this is like one more thing that they cannot take on. That's the environment, even when it affects them very directly, and even more if it affects them somewhat more indirectly, like the plastic, is a difficult things to put in mind. So I do think that if we can improve the lives of people, the material condition of the poor, actually, so sometimes people ask me, well, but if you improve the material condition of the poor, they are going to consume more, and that's bad for the planet. I actually do think that it's going to be good for the planet, because if we improve the material condition of the poor enough, that they are not stressed about when will I be able to finish the week and feed my children and so on, and they have a bit more of mental bandwidth to start thinking about broader issues, the immediate question that is going to come to their mind is, how do we protect this planet of ours, this
Get out from the
village,
day-to-day living
get out
questions.
from the very day-to-day living to the week-to-week, which is
And we
the
had
era.
some data that the removing extreme poverty will increase only 2% of usage, material usage, which will contribute to climate change. So it's not a big factor.
No, and the direct effect of bringing everyone in the world to the international poverty line would be negligible in terms of emissions, because they're consuming so little. So So that will have no direct effect, but I'm pretty convinced that the indirect effect would be positive because you need the mental space to be able to devote yourself to these political issues.
Can we ask someone from the back there? Okay, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, after that, yes, sorry.
Okay, so my question is that first of all, I thank Esther because I met with her after 24 years. I started my career with her in Kolkata in 2001, my first job with her. So that is a different thing. My question is that if there is no politician at all globally, will that help the economist or the policy maker to do what we think?
That is even more difficult than getting improving the climate. But
Question was no politician.
no politician at all.
No.
That's not good.
We need politicians. We absolutely need them, and I think that's it's actually a big error of some political system. For example, in my country, in France, of thinking that we don't need politicians, we can shortcut them with upstart like our president, who is in some sense not a politician. Uh, and I think what we realize when we don't have politicians is that they are absolutely necessary as a way of aggregating opinion, forming movement, and solving collective pressures. So politicians as individuals have all sorts of shortcomings, but politicians as a profession are very much needed. In fact, anybody who feels, committed to the public good, the more, go into politics. The more good people, committed people we have going into politics, the greater the chance we have to solve our collective problems. Thank you.
So, Esther, my question is linked to is an extension actually of the question you were asked in the beginning. And I think my quandary is, are we, besides the fact that there is a certain amount that a rich country should compensate the developing world, etc., to allow them to deal with the problem of global warming, which to a large extent they may not have caused themselves, there are issues that we actually need to deal with ourselves as well, and which in their own ways contribute to the climate crisis. A simple example in our country is waste management. And I think something as basic as waste segregation and understanding what you need to do to recycle and so on and so forth. I have to say, in large parts of urban India, it does not take place, right? I mean, we're all responsible for having garbage which goes out, which is not sort of segregated. Somewhere there's a fundamental lack of both education and ownership of the problem. And I'm just curious as to whether there are examples or ways in which you've seen this addressed in a more effective way in other parts of the world. We've had pockets of this happen in India, for example, the city of Indore, where there was good sort of civic leadership which drove a certain initiative, and then it was a self-fulfilling sort of spiral of people feeling proud of their city and wanting to contribute to it and therefore being, sort of conscious of it. But it bothers me a lot when I think of, I feel one of the most sort of premium parts of, Bombay, for example, Altamont Road, where I have garbage sort of overflowing onto the street. I'm wondering what the role of education is. I'm also wondering why is this not part of school curriculums in a far more detailed way. I mean, do I really need to study, something which is irrelevant to my day-to-day life? Shouldn't I be discussing this if this is going to actually impact me severely in the years ahead?
So let me start by emphasizing your first point, which is that there are things we need to do here. That's completely true. I mean, that's what I was trying to emphasize. Whatever is going to happen in Europe and the US is going to happen. And I think in Europe, it's for sure emissions are going down. And in the US, now they're also going to go down. We need to go down almost by inertia now. So the issue is India, not just India, but the issue is the rest of the world. And the problem needs to be taken ownership there. And it would be completely suicidal for the rest of the world to, out of spite, decide to say, well, you didn't curb emissions, we are not going to curb emissions because that's where a lot of people are talking about. We need every country mitigating onto action at their own level, while of course helping getting their citizens to get access to the energy particular. Now, So that was the first one. Let me emphasize that. Now, for the second part of your question, you gave a great example. Another great example is the city of, it's not India, but similar, is the city of Cape Town, where they almost ran out of water. They almost reached this day zero. And the mayor started a campaign saying, well, this is day zero, it's going to be 125 days. And everybody kind of got together and really the rich people stopped watering their lawn and poor people, conserved water for drinking and everybody did a part and day zero never came. And they feel super proud of that, as they should, and also super happy as they should. And it's also, I think, a good illustration of the fact that, here disaster was literally staring them down in the face. Uh, and in a sense, at a global level, disaster is staring us down in the face. So we should kind of,
We should start as
we should
day
start
zero.
day zero.
Yeah. Hello, I'm a bit nervous because I'm standing in front of you. It's a great privilege that I can interact with you, ma'am. So my question is, do you think population explosion, particularly in countries like India, is a major contributing factor to climate change, and what can actually we do? Because in India there is no such thing as good sex education and all. And secondly, the last question is: do you think human greed is also a contributing factor to climate change?
So population explosion is not. First of all, there is no population explosion anymore. I think what's the problem that is facing us down is that population implosion. No, seriously, like China is going to lose like millions, hundreds of millions of people in the decades to come. India is coming soon after that. Population getting older and so on. Second of all, as we said, the poor people don't consume anything anyways. So the issue is not population explosion. And if anybody tells you that, particularly, white person coming saying, well, it's really population explosion, it's not true. It's really about the second factor, which is human greed, about the fact that the richer people are, the more they consume. It's not proportional, but it's very strong correlation between CO2 emission, how much money people have, and as it's really now a relatively small number of extraordinarily wealthy people that are responsible for most of the emission. An American, the top 10% of the income distribution, emits 122 times more CO2 than a person in Africa in the middle of the income distribution. So this is what needs to be addressed primarily.
Good evening, Esther, and welcome back to the City of Joy. Thank you, Mr. Rudra Chatterjee, for moderating possibly the most important pressing issue in the literary meet. I'm Saurabheshwar. I've been training and mentoring students for career. Career choices and the way we work in the domains can play a vital role, because that's what we have been trying to do at Catalyst. And what would be your take, because ma'am raised a very pertinent point about education. How can school, colleges, universities also address it within their classroom, within their curriculum on a daily basis, and not necessarily as a standalone workshop? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. That's a great career choice for a lot of people actually to be working on this problem. People who are engineers at heart can work on the new engineering technology. People who are information technology people at heart can work about how to better, all of the, to use information technology to optimize grids and things like that. People who are social scientists can think about how you create the right political movement, and of course, there are all the people who can be trained in the environment. So in a way, whatever people do, they can choose a career that are oriented towards addressing this problem. And India is full of like amazing talent that you know high skill level that can be helped in the world. And that's going to be important because I'm not sure if the talent is going to come, say, from the best university in the US. I teach at MIT, where we should be producing this talent in large numbers. But when the students come in, they all want to save the world. By the time we graduate them 4 years later, they all want to make money. And so that I think relates to this point about education, about missing a point, at least in higher education. And if institution like yours or anybody can find a ways to keep people